A widow named Eleanor Price stood barefoot beside the pit, holding a locket that no longer opened. Her daughter, Mary, had died 3 nights before, her skin gray, her eyes wide, as if death had surprised her mid-prayer. But what no one spoke of was the noise that came from the field that same night, a low hum, a chain dragging through the dirt. Eleanor was not a cruel woman, at least not by the standards of 1849. She had inherited her late husband's debts, and the plantation's fields had gone silent without slaves to work them. When the auction came through Milledgeville, she walked there with the last coins she had, 17 cents, enough to buy 1 man. They said he was quiet, strong, and strange. Some whispered he had already died once before. That man's name was Isaiah. The day she brought him home, the neighbors watched from their porches. A white widow with a single slave, it was a pitiful sight. But that night, something changed in the house. The candles burned lower, the clocks stopped, and the air, thick with heat and sorrow, began to hum like something alive beneath the floorboards. When Mary's body was lowered into the earth, Eleanor saw Isaiah standing behind the oak tree, eyes fixed not on the coffin, but on the space beside it. He seemed to know where another grave had already been dug. She told herself she was imagining things, that grief made her see ghosts in daylight. But when she woke the next morning, barefoot prints led from the barn to the graveyard, larger than hers, pressed deep and still damp with red mud. And that was when she learned the first truth buried under this land. The soil remembers who it's owned.
By the time the morning fog lifted from the plantation, Eleanor had convinced herself the footprints meant nothing. The earth held many ghosts, she thought, men, women, beasts, all trampled into the same dirt by years of hands that never owned themselves. But when she went to the barn, she found Isaiah already there, standing perfectly still, facing the far wall where sunlight cut through the boards in thin, sharp lines. He wasn't praying. He wasn't working. He was listening. Eleanor spoke his name once, soft, uncertain. He turned his head slowly, his eyes like wells that didn't reflect the light. "The ground speaks here," he said. His voice was calm, low, the kind of voice that makes you forget what question you asked. "It remembers the girl." Eleanor felt her body go cold. "You mean my daughter?" He nodded once, then turned back to the wall, where dust floated in the sunlight like ash. "No," he said. "I mean the first one." That night she couldn't sleep. The house creaked like it was breathing, and outside something heavy brushed against the shutters. At midnight she lit a candle and went to the window. Isaiah was out in the field, kneeling beside her daughter's grave, his hands pressed into the soil, as though feeling for a heartbeat. When dawn came, she went outside. The grass was flattened around the grave in a perfect circle. In the center lay a small wooden figure, carved crudely from pine, the shape of a child with its arms bound to its sides. She didn't remember seeing it before. And then came the sound. A single strike of the church bell from the next town over, the one that hadn't rung since the fire 3 years earlier. Eleanor dropped the figure. The ground beneath her feet gave a faint, hollow echo, as if something beneath the soil had shifted. She looked toward the barn. Isaiah stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, and said quietly, "You buried her where they buried me." The world around her seemed to stop breathing. The bell echoed again. That was the second truth she learned. Some debts are not of money or blood, but of the soul itself. Eleanor didn't remember falling to her knees, but when she opened her eyes, the sun was burning red against the horizon, and the earth was warm beneath her palms. The words, "You buried her where they buried me," looped in her head like a curse she couldn't shake.
She stared at Isaiah, standing still in the barn's shadow, his face expressionless, his presence almost ancient. "What do you mean?" she asked. "No one is buried here but my daughter." Isaiah didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the field, moving slow, like he was walking through something invisible. His bare feet pressed into the soil with purpose. He stopped near the split-rail fence, bent down, and began scraping at the dirt with his hands. At first it seemed senseless, grief-driven, or mad. But then his fingers uncovered something solid. A rusted chain, still wrapped in the shape of a human wrist. Eleanor staggered backward, her throat closing. No, that can't be." Isaiah looked up at her, his eyes wet with sweat or tears. "They buried us in rows," he said quietly. "Not in graves, in silence." She wanted to run, but there was something about his tone, so steady, so heavy with knowing, that rooted her in place. She had grown up hearing whispers of the old grounds, the patches of land where slaves were said to have been buried without markers, without names. Her late husband had called them the Black Acres. She had never seen one herself, until now. Isaiah pointed toward the oak tree where Mary's grave sat fresh. He said, "That tree fed on us. Roots don't choose what they drink." Eleanor's stomach twisted. The wind carried the smell of soil and something else, something iron, like blood that had never dried. The birds were gone. Even the insects were quiet. "I don't want to hear any more," she whispered. Isaiah stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He said, "Then you'll hear it anyway, because this place remembers the sound of its sins." That night, she dreamed of a woman's voice humming from beneath the ground. The melody was gentle, sorrowful, and familiar, like a lullaby her daughter used to hum before she slept. When she woke, the locket around her neck was open again. Inside it, someone had placed a fragment of rope. That was when she understood the third truth. The dead don't rest until the living remember.
The next morning the air felt wrong, too still, too thick, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with the locket open before her, the piece of rope coiled inside like a small, sleeping snake. She hadn't told a soul what Isaiah said. How could she? In Georgia, 1849, a widow's word weighed less than a whisper. And yet, something inside her, that small, stubborn ember of defiance, told her that what she'd seen wasn't madness. It was memory. By noon, she was standing in the town's small church archive, the air cool and smelling of ink and mildew. Reverend Alden, an old wan with thin hair and yellowed spectacles, shuffled through the records with a trembling hand. "You say his name was Isaiah?" he asked, eyes never leaving the page. "Yes, he was sold to me at the Milledgeville auction. Quiet man, doesn't speak much." The Reverend hesitated. His eyes flicked to her face. "Was he marked?" Eleanor frowned. "Marked?" Alden closed the ledger slowly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There was a man by that name once, Isaiah Ward, a preacher before the law took him. Spoke to the field hands about freedom, about the Lord seeing all men equal. They hung him for it, out by the Black Acres, no grave marker, but his name's written in the death roll." Her heart stopped. "The Black Acres?" she repeated softly. "You mean the fields behind my home?" The Reverend said nothing. His silence was enough. When Eleanor returned to the plantation, she walked straight to the barn. Isaiah was there again, sitting in the same place, his back to her. The faint hum filled the air once more, low, rhythmic, pulsing like a heart beneath the soil. "You remember," he said, not turning.
the preacher, the rope, the tree. "I wasn't here then," she said, her voice breaking. "But your name was." Eleanor froze. "My name?" He turned slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "The Price family owned the acres," he said. "The same hands that cut my tongue when I preached, the same coin that bought me now, it's the same blood that buried me then." Her hands trembled, the weight of 17 cents suddenly unbearable. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but deep down she knew some inheritances aren't wealth, but curses paid in generations. That night thunder rolled across the fields, though no storm ever came, and from beneath the oak she swore she heard the sound of chains clinking in the roots. That was when she learned the fourth truth. Bloodlines do not end, they echo. That night, Eleanor lit every candle in the house. Shadows stretched long and thin across the walls, like memories trying to crawl back into the light. Her family's portraits hung crooked on the hallway wall, and for the first time she saw the faces differently. Their eyes weren't proud, they were watching. The Price name had carried weight once, a symbol of refinement and virtue, but now the very sound of it sickened her. She opened her husband's old ledgers, the ones she had never dared to read. Inside, between the numbers and cotton yields, were names, so many names. Men, women, children, bought, sold, and buried in ink. The last few pages were smeared, as if someone had tried to wipe them clean. At the bottom of one page, dated June 1827, she found the entry. "One slave, Isaiah Ward, disposed of by public order, property reclaimed by Lord's grace." The words felt like rot in her mouth. Reclaimed by the Lord's grace. The hypocrisy of it made her dizzy. She slammed the book shut, and the candle beside her flickered out, leaving a thin curl of smoke in the air. From somewhere deep in the floorboards came a groan, slow, deliberate, the sound of wood remembering weight. Eleanor stepped back, heart pounding. She could feel it now, something rising, not from outside, but from beneath. Then came the whisper, faint, almost childlike. "Do you remember my name?" Eleanor ran, through the hall, down the stairs, into the open field. The moon hung low, white and swollen. The oak tree stood silent, and beneath it Isaiah knelt again, his hands pressed into the dirt. "What are you doing?" she screamed. He didn't look up. "Feeding it truth," he said. "You built your house on our bones. You eat from our fields. Now the land wants remembrance." The ground beneath her feet began to pulse like a heartbeat. She fell to her knees, the earth warm and damp beneath her palms, and for the first time she realized it wasn't soil she felt, it was flesh. That was the fifth truth. The past is not behind you, it's beneath you.
The next morning, the house smelled wrong. Not of rot, something sharper, older, like iron left too long in the rain. The walls themselves seemed to sweat. When Eleanor ran her hand along the plaster, it came away damp and reddish-brown. She told herself it was the humidity, that she was imagining things. But the voice inside, the one that had learned to listen, not to speak, told her otherwise. The fields were dying. Overnight, the cotton had turned gray, not wilted, drained, as though every stalk had bled itself dry. The air hung heavy with a strange stillness. Even the crows had gone. Only the oak stood untouched, its roots thick and black against the morning light. Isaiah was in the same place again, kneeling by the grave. The soil around him had darkened to a near crimson. When she approached, she saw that he'd drawn circles into the earth, wide, deliberate marks, forming patterns too precise to be chance. "What are you doing to my land?" she demanded. He didn't flinch. "Your land?" he said quietly. "Whose hands planted it? Whose blood watered it? The soil knows the truth. It was only pretending to forget. She clenched her fists. "I've done nothing to you." He looked up at her then, his face calm, his voice cutting through her like judgment itself. "You bought me for 17 cents. Do you know what that number means here?" She shook her head. 17 bodies, he said, buried before the war. Your husband's father kept count. Every year he added another to the field until it grew cotton redder than blood. The land learned the price of a man's silence. Eleanor's breath caught. "You lie!" Isaiah stood slowly, the soil falling from his hands like dust from an hourglass. "Then dig," he said. "Dig anywhere you like." She ran. Into the nearest field. She clawed at the ground with her bare hands until her nails broke and her palms burned. The dirt was soft, too soft, and then her fingers brushed fabric. She pulled, screaming, until the earth gave way. What she found wasn't bone, but cloth, a torn fragment of a child's dress, stained dark and still damp with age. Her mind shattered in silence. The wind moved through the dead crops with a sound like whispering voices. Isaiah stood behind her, watching. "That was my sister's, the one they buried alive." And that was the sixth truth. The land doesn't forgive, it keeps score. That night, the house no longer felt like hers. Every door hinge moaned with a kind of memory. Every floorboard breathed. The air pressed close as though the walls themselves wanted to speak, but had waited too long. Eleanor lit the lamps one by one, though each flame seemed to bend away from her, trembling, like it knew something she didn't. She sat at her husband's desk again, the ledger open before her. But now the ink had bled through the paper, the names darker, more legible than before, as if the dead themselves were rewriting their own history. She traced one name with her fingertip. Sarah Ward, age 7. Her blood froze. The letters seemed to shift beneath her touch, becoming darker, wet. And then the sound began, faint at first, like a child humming a tune. The same melody she had heard in her dreams. The same tune her daughter, Mary, used to hum when she was small. The air grew colder. She turned her head, and the mirror beside the desk caught her reflection. Only it wasn't hers. A child stood behind her, dark eyes wide, face streaked with dirt. She wore the same torn dress she had unearthed in the field. She spun around, but the room was empty. But the humming continued. From the hallway, from the walls, from under the floorboards. She stumbled to her feet, calling out for Isaiah, but when she reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The handle was hot, as if fire burned on the other side. She ran to the window and froze. The fields were glowing, not burning, breathing. Every stalk of dead cotton pulsed faintly red, like the veins of something living just beneath the surface. Isaiah appeared in the yard, standing perfectly still beneath the moonlight. He looked up at her through the glass. "You see it now," he said softly. "What was hidden." "Make it stop!" she cried. "Please make it stop!" He shook his head. "It stops when truth is spoken." She turned back to the mirror. The reflection had changed again. The child was gone, replaced by a row of faces behind her, all standing in silence. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. Then Isaiah's voice came again, distant and echoing. "This house is their church. The hymn was written in blood. You've been living in the sermon." The glass cracked down the middle, splitting her reflection into two. That was the seventh truth. Haunting is not the work of ghosts. It's the conscience remembering what the mind refuses to.
Eleanor didn't remember walking to the cellar door. Only the sound of her own breath, quick and uneven, echoing off the narrow hallway. The floor beneath her feet felt soft, almost spongy, like it wasn't wood anymore.
The air smelled of metal and salt. She stopped at the door. It was old, its hinges black with age, the keyhole rimmed with rust that looked like dried blood. Isaiah was already there. He stood with the lantern in his hand, the light cutting a thin circle into the dark. "You've read the names," he said quietly. "Now you'll see where they prayed." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. "Prayed?" He nodded once. "For forgiveness, for profit, for power, all in the same breath." The door creaked open. The smell hit her first, thick, wet, ancient. It wasn't death exactly, but something worse, the scent of things buried but not gone. The cellar stretched deep beneath the house, lined with rough-hewn stone. At the far end stood an altar made of black wood, warped by time. Candles, melted long ago, had fused to the surface. Beneath them, etched into the wood, were words she couldn't read. "This is where your husband's father came to make his promises," Isaiah said. "He built his fortune here. Every season before the harvest, he offered the Lord a tithe, not of money, not of prayer, but of flesh." Her throat tightened. "No, that's not true. My husband was a God-fearing man." Isaiah's eyes flicked toward her. "Yes, and what did he fear more? God, or losing what God gave him permission to own?" The lantern light caught something on the wall. Iron hooks still bolted to the stone. Beneath them, dark stains trailed down to the dirt floor. Eleanor took a step closer. Her shoes stuck. She looked down. The soil was damp again, darker than it should have been. Isaiah's voice was steady, almost tender. "This is why the land hums. The hymn was sung here first. They sang while the blood fell. They said the words made the crops grow stronger." Her stomach turned. "And the children?" she whispered. He looked at her, his face expressionless. "They were the seeds." The lantern flickered. The air pulsed. From somewhere deep in the stone, a faint rhythm began. Not sound, but vibration, like the beating of a heart buried miles below. Eleanor stumbled backward, clutching her chest. The walls seemed to close in, the stones breathing. She could hear faint whispers now, thousands of them, speaking in perfect rhythm with the pulse of the earth. Isaiah stepped forward and placed his hand on the altar. "This is what your name built. This is where the first silence began." The lantern went out. That was the 8th truth. Every empire begins as a prayer and ends as an echo.
Darkness swallowed the cellar whole. Eleanor's pulse thudded so loud it almost drowned the whispers. Almost. They moved through the black like water, brushing her ears in fragments of half-spoken prayers. "Lord, make us prosperous. Lord, make us strong." The voices blended, pleading and proud all at once. Then came a softer one, a woman's, trembling, desperate. "Forgive us, please." Eleanor reached out blindly, her hand brushed against the altar. It was warm now, pulsing faintly beneath her fingers like living wood. When her eyes began to adjust, she realized the faint light wasn't from Isaiah's lantern anymore. It was coming from the walls. The stones themselves were glowing, just enough to show the carvings etched deep into them. Names, hundreds of them. And in the center, at eye level, carved deeper than the rest, was her own last name. Price. Her knees nearly gave out. What did they do here?" Isaiah's voice came from behind her, steady, almost mournful. "What all men of power do. They asked God to bless their chains and called it mercy." She turned to face him. His face was half shadow, half light. "You keep thinking this is about forgiveness. It isn't. This is about remembrance.
Your name sits on top of the silence. My name lies beneath it. I was buried in your family's prayer." The floor shifted beneath them. The ground moaned. Dust fell from the ceiling in slow cascades. And then she saw them, faint figures forming in the corners of the room, like silhouettes drawn in smoke. One knelt at the altar. Another stood behind him with a rope in his hands. The man kneeling was humming, the same melody from before, soft and steady. Eleanor recognized his voice before she realized it, Isaiah's. But the man behind him was white, wearing her family's ring, her husband's ring. Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "No." Isaiah watched her. "He made the vow. He offered my voice for his harvest. He silenced the field so his cotton could speak louder." The figures began to fade, but the humming grew louder, filling every corner of the cellar until the air itself seemed to tremble. Eleanor clutched her chest, gasping, "What do you want me to do?" Isaiah stepped closer, his eyes unblinking. "You must say their names, all of them, aloud, every voice they buried." The light in the stones pulsed faster. The air thickened. Eleanor's throat felt like it was closing, as though the house itself didn't want her to speak. But she forced the first name out. Sarah Ward. The whisper stopped. Then another. Isaiah Ward. The air shuddered. One by one, the stones began to glow brighter, until the entire cellar blazed red. That was the ninth truth. Power does not die. It only waits to be spoken again. Eleanor's lips trembled as she spoke the next name. The air around her quivered like heat rising from asphalt, though there was no warmth left in the cellar, only that pulsing red glow from the walls, like light seeping through a wound. Rebecca. Ward. The glow deepened. Somewhere to her left, a whisper answered. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the emotion of them. Relief, grief, recognition. She gripped the edge of the altar for balance. Samuel Ward. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She looked toward Isaiah, but he was no longer fully there. His outline flickered, body fading in and out of shadow as though the act of remembering was unraveling him. His voice came low and urgent. "Keep going. Every name pulls another truth from the ground." Eleanor swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry, her body trembling, but she kept speaking. Joseph, Naomi, Ruth, Caleb, Miriam. The cellar responded to each name like a heartbeat. The stones throbbed with light, the air pressed tighter. Her voice was shaking, but the words came faster, louder, unstoppable. Then something changed. When she said the 12th name, Elijah, the air turned cold enough to burn. A shock ran through her hands, into her chest. She gasped and saw the cellar dissolve around her. The altar, the walls, gone. She stood in a field, the same one outside her house, but it was different now. The sky was heavy with smoke, the earth cracked and red. The oak tree loomed in the distance, its branches black against the light. Around it, people stood in a circle, heads bowed, their faces hollow. At the center of them, a man knelt, Isaiah. Only now she could see it wasn't the Isaiah who stood in her house. This was another time. The rope hung from the tree above him, frayed and dark. A man stepped forward wearing her family's ring, and she felt the weight of his breath as if it were her own. The man spoke, "Lord, bless this offering, that the soil may yield fruit." The crowd murmured, "Amen." Eleanor tried to scream, but her throat seized. Her hands weren't her own. They were his prayers spilling from her mouth. The world blurred, sound fading into one long hum. Then, just before the rope tightened around Isaiah's throat, he looked at her, not at the man, at her. "You wanted to see. Now you'll remember." Eleanor's body jerked back into the present. She was on her knees before the altar, gasping, tears streaming down her face. Her hands were covered in red soil. Isaiah was gone. Only the humming remained. That was the 10th truth. To remember is to relive, and to relive is to confess.
Eleanor couldn't feel her hands. The air was heavy with a sound she couldn't locate, like 1,000 breaths drawn at once but never released. Her throat burned, though she hadn't screamed. The cellar swayed, shadows moving across the walls as though the glow from the stones was alive, reacting to her heartbeat. She could still taste the dirt. It coated her tongue, bitter and metallic. Every breath felt like breathing through earth. Then, through the ringing in her ears, came a whisper. Not Isaiah's voice, deeper, older, thick with command. "Finish what they began." Eleanor shook her head violently. No, I'm not one of them. I didn't do this." The whisper chuckled, almost kindly. "No one does. They inherit." The light brightened again, and for a moment she saw movement in the corner, figures forming out of smoke and memory. A man in a waistcoat stood beside the altar, a Bible in one hand and a ledger in the other. His features were familiar, too familiar. Her husband's nose, her father-in-law's eyes. He spoke as if reciting scripture. "And the field shall bear fruit by the sweat of the fallen. Their souls shall till the soil, their breath shall rise as wind, and their pain shall be turned to profit." Eleanor covered her ears, but the words still bled through her fingers. The figure looked straight at her. "Say the blessing, Eleanor. It's your turn now." Her knees buckled. She fell forward against the altar, trembling. No, I'm not one of them. I didn't do this." The voice of the ancestor hardened. "You will. The blood remembers the vow. The soil remembers the tithe. Break it, and the land will devour you with them." The ground began to vibrate beneath her, the stones shaking loose from the walls. The altar creaked, splitting along its center. Through the cracks she saw roots, black, glistening, pulsing with life. They reached up toward her, winding like veins. Then, in the chaos, she heard Isaiah's voice again, faint, somewhere above the noise. "Don't speak the blessing. Say the names again. Only the truth breaks the chain." The two voices clashed in her head, one demanding continuation, the other pleading for remembrance. Eleanor's vision blurred, her body convulsed. The red glow surged through the room, and the faces in the walls, faces she hadn't seen before, opened their mouths as one. They whispered a single phrase. "We are still working your fields." The walls cracked, the altar collapsed. The light went out. When silence finally came, Eleanor was on her back, staring up at the cellar ceiling. Her voice was gone. That was the 11th truth. The dead don't haunt the living. They work through them. Eleanor woke to sunlight slicing through the cracks in the shutters. For the first time in what felt like years, the house was silent. No whispers, no humming, just the sound of morning birds somewhere far off in the trees. She was on the parlor floor, the hem of her dress stiff with dried soil. For a moment, she believed she dreamed it all. The cellar, the voices, the faces in the walls. It had to be fever. Grief can make a person see anything they need to. But then she saw her hands. Her nails were caked with red clay, her palms lined with thin black cuts, as though the soil itself had clawed her back. And in her hair, tangled near her temple, was a single cotton blossom, gray, wilted, and damp. She rose slowly, every joint aching. The house groaned beneath her weight, timbers settling like old lungs breathing their last. She called out for Isaiah, her voice hoarse.
No answer. She searched the halls, the kitchen, the porch, but the air felt wrong, off balance. The plantation had always been quiet, but this was something else. This was absence. Outside, the fields had changed again. The rows of dead cotton were gone, vanished overnight. In their place stood hundreds of small mounds, perfectly spaced, each one topped with a sprout of new green growth. It looked like renewal, until she noticed what the soil was made of. It wasn't dirt anymore. It was ash. She stumbled backward, her heart pounded. The smell hit her next, faint but unmistakable. Flesh and smoke. She turned toward the oak tree. The grave was open. Mary's coffin was split down the middle, the wood peeled outward like something had forced its way up through it. And there, kneeling at the edge of the grave, was Isaiah. His clothes were clean, his hands were empty, his face was calm. I told you, the land would feed itself once truth was sown. Eleanor stared at him, trembling. What did you do? Isaiah looked out across the fields. What we did. You spoke their names. You loosened their silence. Now the field grows memory. Each sprout is a soul freed from work. She stared at him, trembling. You mean those mounds? He said, they are what was taken. But the land is hungry still. The roots want balance. The wind shifted. The green sprouts began to move, not from the breeze, but from within, as though something beneath them was pushing upward, alive. The hum returned, low at first, then rising through the air until the earth itself vibrated. The sound was no longer mournful. It was calling. Eleanor fell to her knees. Make it stop, please! Make it stop! Isaiah's expression didn't change. I can't. I was buried in this covenant. You were born into it. Now we both belong to it. The oak's branches twisted overhead, creaking like bones. The light dimmed, and as Eleanor pressed her palms into the ash, the hum moved through her body, steady, rhythmic, unending. That was the 12th truth. The harvest always comes, but it never asks who planted the seed.
By the next evening, the light itself had changed. The sky over the plantation glowed the color of tarnished brass, and everything seemed caught between dusk and dawn, as if time no longer knew which direction to move. The fields shimmered faintly with heat that wasn't heat, a vibration that hummed low in Eleanor's bones. She walked barefoot through the rows of mounds. The new green shoots trembled, not from wind, but from a pulse deep beneath the ground, like the whole plantation had a heartbeat. Every step seemed to awaken something unseen. She could feel memories rise through her skin, laughter, cries, songs, all blurred together. It was then she understood. The harvest Isaiah spoke of was not flesh or crop. It was consciousness. The land wasn't feeding on life, but on awareness. Every generation of Prices had pressed their guilt down into the soil until it became fertile with denial. And now that truth had surfaced, the land was reclaiming what had been buried, memory itself. Eleanor reached the oak tree and stopped. The open grave before it no longer frightened her. It looked almost serene now, the earth breathing softly. Isaiah stood across from her, silent, his eyes reflecting the same dim gold as the horizon. It isn't death that haunts you, he said. It's inheritance. She looked at him, her voice trembling. Then what am I supposed to do? Isaiah nodded toward the horizon, where the faint outline of the old plantation houses could still be seen, roofs collapsed, windows dark. End it, he said. The land doesn't need more bodies. It needs a witness who won't look away. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could feel the generations pressing against her, the weight of every hidden sin, every silence, every prayer said for profit. The hum rose again, now inside her chest, aligning with her heartbeat. It was terrifying and sacred at once, as if the land itself was breathing through her. When she opened her eyes, the world had gone still. The green shoots had turned pale, the soil cooling beneath her feet. The hum softened into something almost melodic, like a lullaby sung from far below. Isaiah's voice came one last time, quiet as dusk. The field remembers, but now it forgives. Eleanor fell to her knees. For the first time, she didn't cry. She just listened. Not to ghosts, not to horror, but to truth returning home. The 13th truth was, forgiveness isn't freedom. It's remembering without running. Eleanor stayed kneeling until the earth cooled beneath her. The humming faded into silence, so complete it almost rang in her ears. When she finally looked up, Isaiah was gone. No footprints, no shadow, no trace. Only the air carried a faint warmth where he had stood. The oak tree loomed above her, its bark scarred with old carvings that she'd never noticed before. Not words, marks. Rows of tiny crosses, some clear, some nearly lost to time. She ran her fingers across them. Each one was a name. Each one had once been a life that her family had buried under faith and profit. And yet the tree stood, alive, enduring. It had seen every horror, absorbed every sin, and still reached toward the light. For the first time, Eleanor saw it not as a symbol of power, but as witness. She rose slowly, her legs weak, and looked across the field. The mounds had flattened now. The sprouts withered into the soil. The land looked bare, almost clean. A strange peace had settled over the plantation. Not joy, not sorrow, but the quiet that follows a storm that had finally finished its work. Eleanor turned toward the house. The windows reflected the dull glow of the fading sky, their surfaces fractured by years of neglect. Inside, she could see her reflection overlapping with the faint shapes of her ancestors' portraits. The eyes of the past stared back at her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She stepped inside. The air was different, no longer heavy. The floorboards still creaked, but the sound was familiar now, almost welcoming. The house was breathing again, not in torment, but in rhythm. Eleanor sat at her husband's old desk, opened the ledger one last time, and took a piece of charcoal from the hearth. She turned to the first blank page and began to write. Not accounts, not debts, but names. Every one she could remember. The ones from Isaiah's voice, the ones from the cellar, the ones whispered by the walls. She wrote until her hand cramped and her tears blurred the lines. The last name she added was her own. When she finished, she closed the ledger gently, as if laying someone to rest. Outside, a soft breeze moved through the empty fields, carrying the smell of clean soil. Eleanor whispered into the silence, "It ends here." And for the first time in generations, the land did not hum. The 14th truth was, the cycle breaks not through vengeance, but through bearing witness without turning away.
The next morning came like mercy. Mist hung low over the fields, thin and soft as breath. The land that had once pulsed with pain now lay quiet, still scarred, still haunted, but breathing in rhythm again. The air was cool, the soil damp, and in that dampness, Eleanor felt something she hadn't known in years, peace that didn't ask for permission. She stood in the doorway of the plantation house one last time, the weight of her old life coiled behind her. The ledgers were gone, burned in the hearth overnight.
Only one remained, the one she had written in, now resting open on the table. Its pages were filled not with numbers, but with the names of those forgotten, their letters dark and soft from ash. She tied the book shut with a piece of rope she'd cut from the cellar and set it beneath the front window, a kind of offering. Whoever came after her, she thought, would see it first thing. A record, a confession, a truth that would not vanish into cotton or coin. The wind moved gently through the hall, fluttering the curtains. The house sighed, as if relieved to be empty. Eleanor walked outside barefoot, the morning dew chilling her skin. She made her way toward the oak tree. The ground was smooth again. No grave, no scar, just earth, cool and quiet. At the base of the tree, she found a single cotton blossom, pure white. She bent down and placed her hand beside it, whispering a prayer without words, something simple and human, the kind that doesn't ask for anything but to be heard. Then she rose and turned toward the road. She didn't look back. As she walked away, the mist began to lift. And though the house behind her faded into shadow, she felt it watching her not in anger, but in understanding, like it finally knew it had been forgiven. The humming never stopped after that. It came through the walls at night, soft at first, like someone humming to a child. Lillian told herself it was the wind or the sound of the crickets beyond the fields, but deep down she knew better. The house had a rhythm again, a heartbeat. Annie began to hum too. At breakfast she would sit at the table, swinging her legs, her lips forming that same tune. When her mother asked her where she'd learned it, Annie said simply, "The lady in the field." Robert laughed it off, said their daughter had an imagination like her mother's. But Lillian noticed that Annie never played outside near the oak tree. She only stood at the window, staring at it, as if waiting for someone to appear. One morning, Lillian found her daughter sitting on the floor of the front room, tracing the names in the old ledger. She'd gone page by page, whispering each name aloud, her small voice deliberate, almost reverent. Lillian froze. "Annie, where did you learn to do that?" Annie looked up, eyes wide and calm. "She told me to. The one who wrote them. She said it's how the field remembers." The room went silent. For a moment, Lillian thought she heard the faint rustle of fabric, like someone moving just behind her. But when she turned, there was only the sunlight slanting through the window. That evening, Lillian dreamed again of the woman in the field, the same woman from before. This time her face was clearer, her eyes were dark and steady, her mouth calm. Behind her, the land shimmered red as dusk. "You live in what was buried, but memory is not meant to be buried forever." Lillian tried to speak, but her throat was tight. "What do you want from us?" The woman's voice was gentle, almost kind. "Nothing you haven't already inherited." Lillian woke gasping, the smell of earth thick in the room. Annie stood by the bed, barefoot, holding the open ledger. "Mama," she whispered, "they're waiting for you to write the rest." Lillian stared at the pages. The last entry ended with Eleanor's name. The space beneath it was blank, empty, as if waiting. That was the 18th truth. The past does not haunt bloodlines. It waits for them to listen. The next morning, the air outside was heavy with mist. The world looked bleached of color, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Lillian walked out barefoot, the ledger pressed against her chest, Annie beside her holding a small trowel. They didn't speak. There was no need. The land hummed softly underfoot, not in warning this time, but in rhythm, as if it knew what was coming. They stopped beneath the oak. Dew clung to its lowest branches, and the bark was dark with age. The earth there felt alive, supple, like skin that had waited generations to be touched again. Lillian knelt. "This is where it ends," she said quietly. Annie looked up at her. "Or begins again?" Lillian smiled faintly. "Maybe both." She dug until the soil gave way, cool and damp. She lowered the ledger into the hollow she'd made, pressing her hand over it once before covering it with earth. When she was done, she sat back and let her palms rest against the ground. The hum grew louder for a heartbeat, then faded into silence. The air cleared. The mist lifted. From somewhere far across the field, a soft breeze stirred the grass, the first true wind the land had felt in decades. For a moment, sunlight broke through the clouds and caught on something white at the edge of the field. A cotton blossom, new and whole. Lillian closed her eyes. In that quiet, she could almost hear voices, not in pain, not in hunger, but in harmony. A single steady sound like breath shared between worlds. When she stood, Annie was watching her. "Is it over now?" the child asked. Lillian brushed the dirt from her hands. "No," she said, "but it's finally remembered." They turned toward the house. Behind them, the earth seemed to settle with a deep, satisfied sigh. No wind, no whispers, just peace. Years later, people would still pass the field and speak of its stillness. Some said the soil there grew richer every year, though nothing was ever planted. Others said that on certain mornings, if you stood beneath the oak, you could feel the ground breathe. That was the 19th truth. Remembrance is not a burden. It is the soil from which healing grows. They say the ledger was found after a storm, unearthed by roots that had broken through the softened ground. The paper should have turned to dust, but it hadn't. Every page was intact, every name still legible, as though the earth itself had protected it. The historian who found it didn't believe in hauntings. He came only to document, to collect, to categorize. But when he touched the cover, the air grew still, and he swore he felt a vibration, faint, steady, like a heart that had never stopped beating. He read the first line aloud. The field answered with a whisper of wind. And though he couldn't explain it, he said the house seemed to exhale. He took the ledger to a museum in Savannah, but it was never placed on display.